I know that Jenna often started off with a prayer to help her get through the sermon. So I ask that you say a little prayer to God that I don't make a mess out of this, please. Matthew's gospel tells us that when we reach out to others, to the sick, the poor, the imprisoned, our neighbors, those in all kinds of need, we are actually reaching out to Christ, whether we know it or not. And often when we do, when we cook for the homeless, when we give to the poor, work at the food bank, visit the sick, when we sew for our veterans, we're actually reaching out to Christ. We're also in many tiny ways disrupting the status quo. We are upsetting systems which push people down. This is called effective disruption. One of the first recorded instances is that of Zelophehad and his daughters, Maliah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tiraz. Zelophehad had died, leaving his 5 daughters without their inheritance, which in the time of Moses would go to the family clan and not to the girls. Ignoring society's rules, the sisters sat down and pled with Moses to receive their father's inheritance. And he agreed. This is the type of effective disruption that opens the door to other women and changes the status quo. Esther and Ruth are the only 2 women in the Bible who have their own books. Esther's story is probably very familiar to most of you. Her relevance to God's story cannot be understated. Orphaned and living in Babylon, Esther wins, unbelievably, a beauty contest and becomes a queen, part of the king's harem, if you will. Through her uncle, she unveils a plot to kill all the Jews in Babylon. Esther, breaking all sorts of rules and risking her life, begs the king for the life of the Jews, including herself. The king loves her enough that he relents. Now, I tell you, the story is much richer, and if you have the time, take a moment to read Esther. It also rather reads like a CNN or a New York Times story right now. Plots, counterplots, politics. But let's focus on Esther. What she does is almost unthinkable. She has not been summoned to the king. She fasts, prays, takes up her courage. She goes directly to the king, and by doing so, risks her life. Instead of immediately begging for herself and her people, she offers him a banquet. And there she pleads for the life of the rest of the Jews. By pleasing the king, he recognizes her value. Now, she doesn't bully. She doesn't get righteous and angry. She isn't strong, proud, or loud. But what she does is disruptive, and it could have cost her her life and the life of all the Jews living in Babylon. What she does, she changes history for the Jewish people and for the good. In the book of Acts and Philippians, we meet Lydia. Although a Gentile, Lydia has been worshiping with the Jews. When Paul comes, she found her heart open to Christ. She becomes the first convert in Philippi. Lydia is an unusual woman. We know this even before we know almost anything else about her. Women are just not mentioned that frequently in the Bible. Their names stand out. Lydia stands out. She was a dyer of cloth, that lovely royal purple cloth. And because of this, she made money. She was an independent and wealthy woman, a very unusual woman. She owned her own home, a large home, which when she converted, she offered to Peter and Silas. This offer gave them a base of operations from which to preach and to go out on missions. Lydia's home became the meeting place for all the new converts to talk and to learn about Christ. She was a remarkable woman with a remarkable asset who gave generously and lavishly to the early Christians of Philippi. She disrupted the status quo by giving Peter a home base and thus giving Christianity a foothold in all of Macedonia. The very first thing we hear about Tabitha, known also as Dorcas, is that she's a disciple. She's a follower of Christ. Now, the word disciple in the Greek, in the feminine form, is used only once in the Bible, and it's used to describe Tabitha. Her story in Acts tells of her sewing for others and giving to the poor. Doubtless, she set a high standard for those around her. But far from being prideful, she was loved by the women of her community. When she sickened and died, it was they who washed her body and clothed her. They reached out to Paul, who was nearby. They were quick to show Paul all the things that she had made for them and for others. Paul emptied the room and prayed over her through the Lord and raised her from the dead. News like that spreads like wildfire. Tabitha reminds us of the awesome power of Christ, the awesome power of the small and the weak. Tabitha was renowned locally because of her giving to others. She magnified the Spirit of the Lord, much like Hannah's song we read earlier, by giving and living the life Christ espoused. In her death and faith, she was brought back to show the power of Christ and the power of faith. But more than that, she was and is an example of what faith can do through our lives. She was just a local woman. She was just a giver to her community. She was just a local seamstress or a quilter or one who donates time, energy, and resources to the shelter or to the poor or to the homeless. She was just us. She reminds us not to sell ourselves short, not to belittle the gifts that we have and those we share with others. Her life and works ask us to reframe our own thinking about our lives and our worth. Just living the just and righteous life of Christ's disciple is living a worthy life. Was Tabitha a disruptor? I think she was, before Paul even steps into the picture. We know she was giving to the poor and sewing for those who in need, a philanthropist, a disciple. Everyone knew her, and everyone knew she was righteous. Anyone who lives that kind of life sets standards for those around without meaning to do so. By living, she pushed others to follow Christ and to live that worthy life. But when she died and was brought back, she disrupted the known universe. Sure, many had heard the wild tales of Christ bringing back others from the dead and he himself being resurrected. People knew this, but seeing this is altogether different. The Bible tells us that many people were brought to Christ through this. Today, I've become aware of 3 women who are disruptors for God. Briefly, they are Marian Wright Edelman, founder and president emeritus of the Children's Defense Fund. She brings to light the disgraceful fact that children in the United States remain the poorest age group in our nation, only made worse through COVID. The CDF champions children's and youth's health and education, protection from gun violence and abuse and criminalization. She's certainly a disruptor of the status quo. Reverend Liz Theodoros of the PCUSA, who focuses her ministry and serves as co-chair on the Poor People's Campaign, in which to eradicate poverty. Her ministry deals with racism, poor standards of living, health, and the right to work with dignity. She knows she must disrupt the entire system to address economic oppression. Beth Du Bois of the Appleseed Outreach in Syracuse, New York, has a mission in her community to offer hot meals, worship, a food pantry, and a housing project called Tiny Homes for Good to the homeless. She also reaches out to veterans by teaching them to rehabilitate abandoned city apartments for survivors of domestic abuse. Each of these women are effective disruptors, and we celebrate them. We celebrate their reliance on the Lord to change the status quo for the better. to bring justice to a world that needs fairness, dignity, and love. Look around at our little community. Do you see any disruptors there? Those who follow Christ, not in word, but in deed. Do you see them? It's my hope that today we can all walk out of church ready to disrupt for God. Amen.